Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of our IPC Youth, Junior Youth. I'm Chris. I'm glad that I'm here with you guys again today. I just thought I'd talk to you about Joseph this week. He's been on my mind since this whole COVID thing started, and we'll just get into it right now. But first things first, pause this, go give your mom a hug, tell her you love her, and it's Happy Mother's Day. And be sure to thank her for the meals she feeds you, for the school that she's been teaching you, for everything else she does for you, running to hockey or sports or K to K or getting to get a church or youth group or anything. She deserves a big shout out, and you need to remember that. So go give her a hug right now. Now, let's play the blame game. So, what have you been blamed for when something went wrong? Or who has blamed you? Now, if you've got brothers or sisters or good friends, you've probably played the blame game at least once or twice in your life already. Still happens with me. It happens with my kids. It happens with people I know. It happens with anybody. Somebody feels wronged or slighted, feels like they've got the short end of the stick, and they blame somebody to make them feel better or just because they don't think it's fair. And can you think of a time when you were blamed for something that you didn't do or that you didn't deserve? Just let that sit in for a while, because Joseph could have played the blame game almost his entire life. So whenever I'm talking about Joseph, think about that. Think about, if I was in his situation or if I was in his shoes, who would I blame? What would I blame anybody, or is it okay because it all works out in the end, because we know the end of the story, but he didn't? Now let's play the blame game, COVID edition. We've got countries blaming countries. There are certain countries blaming other countries for letting COVID get into their country or not doing enough to keep COVID in their own country. There are politicians blaming politicians because they are saying the house arrest or the people are not working, they need money, the social distancing is too strict, people need to live, people need to see each other. There are so many politicians blaming other politicians about what can happen and what can't happen. And then there are people blaming countries and politicians just because their life has been turned upside down. People have lost their job. You can't go to school. You can't do your sports. You can't see your friends. The only thing that happens is doing a Zoom or doing a FaceTime or something like that, or you're stuck at home with your brothers and sisters or your family. Sometimes it can be hard. With all that being said, we can all agree on one thing. COVID and the new normal has not been easy, and it's not very fun. But does this new temporary normal agree or disagree with you? Do you have anybody to blame for this? Or do you just accept it and try and make the best of it? So let's talk about Joseph. So Joseph lived about 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years before Jesus was born. You can find him at the very end of Genesis in the Bible. And he was 17 years old when we first read about him, when his father Jacob gave him the beautiful coat because he was his favorite son of the 10 or 11 brothers. But the 10 or 11 brothers did not like him. They resented him because he was their favorite. And he would come out saying things about dreams, that I had a dream that all my brothers bowed down to me. I had a dream that I was the one strong sheaf of wheat and 10 other sheaves bowed down to me. If you say that to your brother or your sister, there's going to be a bit of a problem. That does not go well usually. So Jacob sent Joseph out to see his brothers who were out tending the sheep. And his brothers, who basically hate him, decide they want to kill him. But the one brother, Reuben, he said, let's just throw him in a dried up cistern and then give him a, basically he wanted to give him a break so they wouldn't kill him to save his life. Well, they end up selling him instead. They sold him into slavery. So blame game. Do you think Reuben was blamed? Or do you think Reuben could blame anybody for being talked into selling his brother when he was trying to save his life? And how would Joseph blame his brothers? Did he blame them? Or did he just say, it's one of those things, I'll be fine? He probably blamed them. I would. It's one of those things. It's human nature to think about yourself first. But Joseph was a different kind of guy. Maybe he didn't. He said he still loved the Lord and he did his thing, and that's how he probably got through most of this stuff. So while he was in slavery, he was taken to Egypt and he was sold to Potiphar, who was an official of Pharaoh. And he was very successful in Potiphar's house. He ended up becoming one of the head people that ran Potiphar's affairs in his house. The Bible says the only thing Potiphar worried about was what he would eat. Basically, that meant everything else was taken care of by Joseph. He ran his affairs, he ran the house, he ran all the servants and the slaves. He just took everything that he could and just took it all from Potiphar and let him do it. And he did it because he served with a good heart. Now, one thing that Joseph didn't have was Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar's wife, we don't know a whole lot about her. We don't even know her name. She's just as Potiphar's wife. She came on to Joseph. She wanted Joseph, but he was a stand-up guy and he just said, no, I can't do it. You are Potiphar's wife. You're not mine. I have everything else in Potiphar's kingdom here. You're not one of it. I don't want you. So she makes this trumped up charge that Joseph raped her and left her, and Joseph gets thrown into jail. I'm sure Potiphar himself didn't really want to do this, but he had to follow his wife. This may not even been the first time the Potiphar's first wife did something like this. The Bible doesn't say. There's some speculations that it wasn't. But in this case, it happened, and now Joseph is in jail. Now let's play the blame game again. Do you think Joseph could blame Potiphar's wife because of what happened, right? Do you think he still has some underlying blame for his brothers for getting him into the situation of slavery, which put him into Potiphar's house, which could put him by Potiphar's wife to be thrown into jail? But he served the Lord still, and he served it with his whole heart, because he even found favor with the warden, and the warden put Joseph in charge of the entire jail. So he went from running Potiphar's house to now running the jail. And just like what happened with Potiphar, the warden didn't pay much attention about anything when Joseph was running the jail. So the warden entrusted Joseph with everything, just the same way Potiphar did. And this is when Joseph meets the cupbearer and the baker. You probably know the story too. I'm probably not surprising you guys with anything. But the cupbearer and the baker were both thrown in jail, and they had dreams, and they didn't know what those dreams meant. And Joseph interpreted the dream saying that the cupbearer would be restored to his status, but the baker would be dead in 3 days. And 3 days after the dreams were interpreted was Pharaoh's birthday. And one of the things that somebody does on their birthday, a pharaoh or a king does on their birthday, is they will free somebody or execute somebody as a public show. So the cupbearer got his position back. Now, we don't have a cupbearer. That doesn't mean anything to us. But a cupbearer was somebody that actually tried all the food and the wine before the king or the ruler did, so that he wouldn't be poisoned, because poison was a very easy way of trying to kill somebody. So the cupbearer was somebody that did that for the pharaoh, But because he was around the Pharaoh all the time, he became a very good friend to the Pharaoh because he had every single meal with the Pharaoh. And a lot of people would come and sit with the Pharaoh and learn from him. But this cupbearer had the advantage of being with him all the time. Now, the baker was the other story. He would end up, we don't know what happened with him other than he was executed. So his end in the royal house was over. So before the cupbearer was reinstated to his status, Joseph asked him, "Remember me when you get to the Pharaoh and say, I am a man that was put here into slavery. I've not committed a crime. I'm under the reign of somebody that isn't my God. Think about me." Well, the cupbearer forgot. And Joseph is still in jail 2 years later. So just think about that. We've been under quarantine or under social isolation for 2 months, right? That is nothing compared to the amount of jail time and the amount of slavery and servanthood that Joseph has been in. So we're blaming our own politicians and whoever, if we do. Joseph could have easily played the blame game as well. But Pharaoh ends up having 2 dreams that neither the magicians or the wise men or anybody in his house or in his circles could interpret. And that's when the cupbearer finally remembers about Joseph. And he probably just kind of sheepishly went up to the Pharaoh and said, "Listen, I don't want to remind you that you put me in jail, but there's a man in jail that interpreted my dream, and maybe he can interpret yours." So Pharaoh calls for Joseph. They clean him up because he'd been in jail, and they did not give 2 thoughts about sanitary or showers. It was just, you're in your own filth. So they clean him up, they get him in front of the king, and he interprets the dreams, and he interprets them correctly. And we all know the story, but he has 2 dreams of 7 fat cows, and then 7 thin cows come out of the river and eat the 7 cows. In the same way, they've got 7 heads of grain, and 7 dried out heads of grain eat the 7 healthy heads of grain. And Joseph interprets them saying, you're going to have 7 great years of harvest, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine, and you need to be prepared for that. So Pharaoh says, "I don't know who else to trust. You're the only person that could give me the interpretation of the dream, so I'm going to put you in charge." So then all of a sudden he goes from the bottom of the barrel of a jailed person to second in command. So he's basically running the same thing that he did in Potiphar's house years earlier, but now it's with the Pharaoh on a much larger scale because it's the whole country of Egypt. So he's made second in command. So here comes the 7 good years. So just to put this into context, Joseph was 30 years old when Pharaoh gave him his opportunity to become second in command. He was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. So that's a span of 13 years that he was put into slavery, servanthood, the whole deal. There are some of you guys watching right now that aren't 13 yet. So that's pretty crazy that he was in some sort of slavery for that long. But he served God, he had a good heart, and Pharaoh rewarded him for it. So the one thing was 1/5 of every single harvest needed to be put in storage from the good years to go for the bad. And in Genesis 41, verse 49, it says there was as much grain in those first 7 years like sand from the sea. Joseph stopped counting it. It was so much. So there was an abundance upon abundance in those good years. But then came the 7 years of famine. And the famine spread across Egypt and into all the other neighboring countries of Egypt. And all the people called the Pharaoh needing food because they had heard that there was some. So when all of this happened, they called the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh just said, "Go to Joseph. He knows what to do. He's running the show." So they ended up going to him, and Genesis 41 to verse 56 says, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold the grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. Basically, Joseph was in charge, so he started accumulating all the money. Everybody came, paid him silver and gold or whatever they could for food, because it was a complete drought and a famine across the entire land. So word had spread out into Jacob and Israel of Judah, of what was going on in Egypt, that Egypt had food. And Jacob and Joseph's brothers, they did not have food. They were part of this famine. So they needed to come, and they needed to come to Egypt. So Jacob sends his brother, Joseph's brothers, to Egypt to buy grain. Now they did not recognize Joseph. It had been 13 years. He was probably dressed like an Egyptian now. He had a wife that was an Egyptian. He talked like an Egyptian. But Joseph recognized them. So he starts toying with them, and he tests them, and he played mind games. Most of those chapters he would started to say, where are your brothers? Aren't you missing one? Is your father alive? All these questions that were very direct, because he knew the family, but the brothers didn't realize this. And then they would give him grain, but he would put the gold and the silver back in the grain, so that when it came back to Jacob, Jacob's like, you stole the gold that you were supposed to pay, and you got the grain. How are we ever going to go back and get more grain from Egypt if you do something like that? So Joseph was just tormenting them. And Joseph, after chapters of this, he finally reveals his identity to his brothers. And in Genesis 45, verse 4 and 5, he says, come to me when they have done what he said. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives, and God sent me ahead of you. So even then, there was no blame. He had no blame on his brothers. I'm sure his brothers were blaming each other or blaming somebody for what they were in with all the games and mind tests and everything else that Joseph was doing to them. They were blaming anything. Who knows? But Joseph had a forgiving heart, and he had a good heart. And he said, brothers, don't worry. I've got you. God sent me ahead. That's a long way. 13 years is a long time to have that in his head, saying, God's putting me somewhere. God's putting me somewhere. It's okay. God's going to get me there. It's all right. So with Egypt reaping the rewards, this was a 7-year famine. So when there was no food in the land, first thing Pharaoh did, or Egypt did, was collected all the money. And when all the money had ran out, he started collecting all the livestock. And then all the livestock as payment for food. And then all the livestock ran out. So now Joseph and the Pharaoh in Egypt had now collected all the money in the area and had collected all the livestock in the area. So now he started buying land, and they started selling. And the people were like, you can buy my land and buy me as a slave or a servant. So he did that for food, because they were desperate. They needed food because they would die if they didn't. And then he ended up giving them seed and saying, I will give you seed, you farm your land, but 1/5 of it has to come back to my heart as payment to me. So he was not only got all the gold, all the livestock, and he got all the land, he had people working for him now and giving him a payment of 1/5 of the harvest. So they were exponentially growing in wealth and in power just because of what Joseph had done years earlier, 14 years earlier to be exact, that before like when he interpreted the dreams. So the rest of Joseph's life, he ended up taking care of Jacob and all his brothers and all his wives and all his kids and all his nieces and nephews and everybody in Egypt for the rest of his life and the rest of Jacob's life. Jacob ended up living to be 147 years old. He took care of everybody, and Joseph himself died at 110. So he was quite old himself, but not as old as his father. But when Jacob passed away, his brothers got worried again, because his brothers were worried that the only reason why Jacob was being kind to them was because, or Joseph was being kind to them was because Jacob was alive. So they were starting to worry. And this Genesis 50 verse 20 is what when Corona hit, this was one of the very first things that I thought of. It said, don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So he knew what the devil meant for bad, the evil in his brother's hearts 13 years ago or a lifetime ago, selling him into slavery. That wasn't God's plan, but God was able to use it and still save Jacob, which was Israel, and all of his family through the hardest times of famine and death, and let them survive and thrive and flourish because they sent Joseph there ahead of them. So I came across a devotion quote just a week or so ago, and I wanted to read it to you. And it was kind of had something about not the blame game, but it's easy to do the blame game here. But it was also a bit of patience and waiting. You need to wait in the hard times just so that you can understand what God's trying to do. So I'm going to read it for you now. I have come to understand that I am not the author of my own story. My narrative is being penned by the one who is the definition of all that is wise, loving, pure, true, and good. But since I am in the story, but not the author of the story, I am often called to wait. I wish that I could say that I wait well, but I don't. I wish that I could say that I never question your wisdom, but I do. So Lord, once more I ask for the grace to wait, not only that I can get what I am waiting for, but so that I will become what you want me to become as I wait. So COVID hasn't been easy. Is it a test? Maybe. Are we seeing the best in people? Yes. Are we seeing the worst in people? Absolutely. When you're around your family for as much as you are, you're going to see the best and the worst. It's just human nature. But what got me most in this quote is that I'm not the author of my own story. It isn't me. We're not the author, but we're in the story. And that's the best part, because it is God's will. God will take what the devil means for bad and turn it into good. Just like with Joseph being put into slavery, turned into good 13 years later, when he was turned into one of the most powerful men in the world at that time and saved his whole family and saved the whole Jewish people, really. So for that, let's say a word of prayer, and you guys can keep on going on with your Sunday. Treat your mothers well. They treat you better than you could even hope. So say a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, and thank you that we could still be together, and thank you for the technology that lets us do this, even though we can't see person to person. We can be here, we can learn something, and when all this gets back together, we can do the face-to-face, and we can still do all the fun things that we do and are used to and being together. But until then, we wait. We'll just wait and be patient, and we'll know that we are taken care of, we are safe, and that we need to be. And we look forward to seeing everybody when we can, and just we be patient and we wait for when we can do that. Help us have a great day and a great week. In your name we pray. Amen. just paused it.
We just paused it?
Yeah.